Alrighty, good evening everybody and welcome to our fall Newman Lecture, Educated or Brainwashed, with our amazing speaker, Dr. Holly Peterson. This is the first installment of our lecture series on faith and reason. Whether you're a student, a faculty member, or a member of the larger community, we'd like to welcome you. My name is Rebecca Bradley, and up here beside me is my good friend, Connor Kelly. We both work for the Newman Center at the Oregon State University, which is a Catholic ministry. We put on events like this one for the greater OSU community.
Yes, as Rebecca mentioned, my name is Connor. I graduated from American University in the summer, and I just moved to Oregon this past August to work with the Newman Center. I've been attending Newman Lectures for the past year, both in person at American University and through online webinars hosted here at Oregon State. And through this series, I've been exposed to intellectual formation that's expanded my worldview and deepened my own understanding of Christianity, the faith, and the church.
We especially would like to welcome anybody who's here for their very first Newman Lecture. Dr. Peterson is just the first of a series of amazing speakers who will be presenting discussions on urgent and thought-provoking topics surrounding matters of philosophy, social issues, and religious belief. I anticipate that through this lecture and participant questions, together we can come to a deeper understanding of what it means to be educated.
So I'd like to take a moment to explain how the night's going to go before we start the presentation. Dr. Peterson's going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then following the presentation, there will be time for questions. Rebecca and I will be at the front of each of these aisles to prompt you when you want to ask a question. And when we welcome all questions, but for the sake of time and so that we get as many people up here to ask questions, we're going to request that you only ask one question and try to keep it as concise as possible, please. Also, we're going to ask that you keep your phones silenced for the duration of the talk and question time, so we don't disturb the speaker or anyone who's trying to ask a question. Awesome. So now we're going to welcome up our director of the Newman Center, Father John Potts, to share a few words with us.
Thank you, Connor. Thank you, Becca. So on behalf of the Newman Center at Oregon State University, welcome to this edition of the Newman Lectures. The Newman Lectures aim to foster a very important and crucial dialogue, the dialogue between faith and reason, and between faith and the culture. And both of these realms, faith and culture, aim to, or had to do at least, with the shaping of a mindset. And that is what we usually call education. That is why I think today's lecture on the meaning and purpose of education fits very well to our Newman Lecture series. And the Catholic Church has always been deeply invested in education. And it is the institution that has founded and runs more schools and universities than any other in the world. It's the institution that educates more people, has done throughout the whole history of Western culture. And the theme of education also was very dear to Cardinal Newman, after whom these lectures are named. Cardinal Newman once wrote that it is education which gives a man a clear, conscious view of their own opinions and judgments, a truth in developing them, an eloquence in expressing them, and a force in urging them. It teaches him to see things as they are, to go right to the point, to disentangle a skein of thought, to detect what is sophistical, and to discard what is irrelevant. This is a high view of education, and I think it's one that is worth exploring. I think it's what Dr. Peterson is going to present to us today. And very fittingly, though unplanned, today the church celebrates the feast day of St. John Henry Newman. So now allow me to introduce our speaker for this evening. Dr. Holly Peterson has an extensive history as an educator. She has served as a high school teacher, principal, and college professor at both the University of San Francisco and the Catholic University of America. She focused her doctoral work on the educational methodology of Servant of God, Monsignor Luigi Giussani. I think we're going to hear more about him tonight. He was the founder of the worldwide Catholic movement, Communion and Liberation. Dr. Peterson currently works as the Assistant Superintendent for Academics for the Diocese of Columbus, Ohio. So, welcome, Dr. Peterson.
Thanks, Father. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Oh, I'm not on. Okay, you can hear me now? 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 We're good? We're good? Okay. Okay, so first of all, thank you very much, Becca and Connor and Father, for that very nice introduction. I'm very happy to be here at this OSU. I actually live near the other OSU, Ohio State University, and so I'm happy to be out of Buckeye Nation and Beaver Nation. So thank you so much for the welcome, and I've just had a wonderful day with your volunteers, and I'm really blessed to be here. So thank you, and thank you all for coming, because to come out on a Wednesday night is not probably something that you would do by nature. So hopefully this will bless you, this topic. So I must begin by saying that I'm very humbled by giving this talk. Monsignor Luigi Giussani, who's now servant of God in the Catholic Church, is someone who I greatly admired, and is someone who was definitely a father for me and continues to be a father for me. So I'm a little small for this huge topic, but I hope really to give credence to who this guy is. So in 2015, Pope Francis said something that was very interesting. He said that, quote, "We are living in an epoch of change." Sorry, we're not living in an epoch of change. We're living in a change of epochs. That is, we're living in an evolution of a structure that we're living in that's not just a technological evolution, but an experience evolution. Really, a difference in our history has happened so fast that even to put your finger on what happened, what changed, is very challenging for us. I'm certainly seeing this change in my 40 years as an educator, and the expectations of the teachers have definitely changed. Preparedness of students coming to school definitely changed. The cost of education, the changes in curriculum, technology in the classroom, etc. Not to mention the immense change in the cultural context in which our schools exist. Not too long ago, I had a very interesting experience. I was in a CVS. I went into a drugstore to get a few things. And as I walked in, right after me was a group of police officers, and I walked in, and there was a man who was clearly homeless, sitting on the floor. And he was in the midst of all these broken bottles. A whole display of bourbons and whiskeys had collapsed all over him. And he was clearly drunk, okay? So at this point, by this time, the police got there, they found him, and the gentleman was an older man. He was shoeless, he had holey socks, and apparently he was seriously alone. I couldn't hear what they were saying back and forth, but I could hear what the man had said after they dialogued a little bit, and at a certain point, he said very calmly, "I would like to go to jail." And so the police asked him a few more questions. He was very calm. He got handcuffed, and they walked him out to the squad car. So then I got in line to get my few items, and the woman behind me said, "Wow, what a night." And the woman, the cashier, responded to her saying, "I knew that was going to happen. I knew it the minute he walked in, trouble." And that really shook me up. When I got to my car, I thought, wow, what happened there? So no one seemed surprised or sad that this man was by himself and taken off to a squad car. Someone your father's age, who's shaggy and drunk and homeless. And the only thing we can say is exciting night and wow, I knew it. You know, so I know for me, I mean, I don't want to judge these ladies because I found myself in that position many, many times with different situations. But I think it hints at what the Pope is speaking about, that we are in an epochal change. We're in a time when it's not just a question of change of technology, as I said earlier. So almost 30 years ago, before Pope Francis made that statement, Luigi Giussani gave an analogy of this epochal change. And he said this. He said, it's as if an experience of Chernobyl has happened. The Chernobyl effect has happened within us. And so for you younger ones in the office, in the audience, which is everyone almost, Chernobyl, just to give you an idea, there we go. Chernobyl, just to give you an idea, was a nuclear power plant that was in the Ukraine that exploded in 1986. And basically one of the reactors caught fire, total meltdown, and just this spewing of radioactivity everywhere. People died in the immediate area, and from that point there were animals that had these crazy mutations, etc. So about 95,000 miles of radius around the area was affected by this radiation. And in fact, I read there was a statistic that said like it's going to take 20,000 years for the radiation to dissipate. So today you can see that that there's a big sarcophagus they built over this reactor to keep the radiation in, so to speak. So anyway, I digress into Chernobyl, but it's as if we've had this Chernobyl effect. That is, we look the same, we go to school the same, we go to work the same, we have babies, get married, hopefully in the other direction, but it's as if our humanity's been hollowed out. It's as if our humanity is gone. There's an emptiness, a lack, a void, an evacuation of some spirit that's pretty palpable. And you see it all around you, especially here at the university, I'm sure. We don't know what to think. We don't know how to feel. We're not sure how to behave sometimes. We struggle to make decisions about education or whether to ask a girl out or whether to go to class or not. It's easier to make a snap judgment on emotional criteria, what's in fashion or the common thinking, rather than really express what we have within us. Czesław Miłosz, who was a Polish Nobel Prize winner, said this. He said, "We've been given to understand that we live only by the grace of the powers that be. Therefore, let's just busy ourselves sipping coffee and catching butterflies." So this is one step closer, So this lack of judgment that he would say, this lack of ability to judge the situation in which we're in, the lack of ability to even to judge my daily situation is really a deep challenge that affects not just your life, but the way in which Christianity passes from person to person. And education is certainly not immune from this epochal change, as we'll talk about in a minute. Cardinal Christophe Pierre, who's the papal nuncio to the United States, that means he's the Pope's representative to the US, he understood this when he recently said, "How many of us, when we speak of education today, speak of it as forming good citizens or creating effective leaders for society. It is the nature and purpose of education not only to prepare people to serve for the needs of society. Is that what education is for? We've been shifting from the person to his or her needs, we've been shifting from the person and his or her needs to the role he or she plays in society." So tonight I want to share with you the life of one who I think addressed this epochal change some 70 years ago, before Pope Francis said that. Luigi Giussani is his name, and because he is rightly considered one of the greatest educators of the 20th century, it's probably good that you would be familiar with him. So he was born in 1922 in a little town called Desio in Italy, in the region of Brianza, for those of you who know Italy, in a home which was, quote, "filled with music and faith and love, but very poor on bread." And much of his pedagogy, his way of looking at education, comes from his childhood, his background. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about that. So a few examples from his childhood. He gives an example of being 5 or 6 years old and going with his mother to Mass. And Mass in those days, was at 5:30 in the morning. So he would go with his mom to a daily Mass sometimes. And he was a little one, and his mom had his hand. And when they were walking to Mass one morning, there was a star, the morning star was in the sky. And his mother said to him, "Look, Gigione, look." How beautiful is God and how great is the world. How beautiful is the world and how great is God. So he grew up in that environment where he understood that beauty had to do with God. That beauty wasn't random, it wasn't just there. I mean, beauty for him was always connected with God. Another example, his father was a socialist. He was not a Catholic until after he had become a priest. But anyway, he was walking downtown with his father, and his father, he remembers multiple times saying, Gigi, give a hand, shake a hand, say hello, right? So his father taught him that the world is bigger than me, my family, and my friends. The world is everyone I encounter. And a third example is when he was a child, his mother, when she'd tuck him in at night and they'd say their prayers, she would always say things like, let's remember the poor in Japan, or let's remember the ongoing war, or let's remember the children today in Russia who have no food. And so again, he learned this economy of sacrifice, that, that I can do something that would affect the lives of others. So anyway, he grew up in this very faithful environment, which was really full of proposals. At the age of 10, and that was in 1932, he entered the pre-seminary, and after completing that elementary school, he went on to the seminary, in a seminary called Venegono. During those adolescent years of the theologate studies in Venegono, he found his professors to be extremely well-read men and profoundly religious. Intellectual men who were deeply, deeply human. So Giussani's adolescent enthusiasm and desire was met with an insightful meaning that was given by his professors, who saw Christ as the center of all things. So his professors, they were clear that they were teaching different things, but Christ was always the center. For example, Father Giovanni Colombo, who later became the Archbishop of Milan, was Giussani's literature teacher. And from him, he developed a real passion for the written word, especially secular works like Montale or Ribera, or for Pavese or Leopardi. So all of these people exposed him to the depth of the human spirit. So these writers were pagan writers. They were not Christian writers. But his professors, who were the priests who ran the seminary, exposed him to the depth and the beauty of literature in that way. And later he understood that these men were prophets for Christ, 1900 years after Christ had already come. He also had another professor which probably marked his life more, whose name was Gaetano Corti. And he claims that he absolutely learned the most from him. But there was one moment in particular I'm going to tell you about. He said he was really fascinated by Courtney's lessons because he recalled the words of St. Thomas, or he recalled the words of St. John, etc., and really gave flesh to them. And one was a passage that they heard every day after Mass. He said every day after Mass, this passage, the first page of John's Gospel, was read. He said, I was 15 years old when Corti explained the first page of John's Gospel. At the time, the passage was read, as I said, after Mass every single day. But then came that beautiful day when he explained them to me and to the rest of us. He said, the Word of God, that is, the words that which all things were made, was made flesh. That means beauty was made flesh, goodness was made flesh, justice was made flesh, love, life, and truth were made flesh. A few of Giussani's classmates also marked his life. They were Enrico Manfredi, and he was the opposite of Giussani, completely disorganized, the class clown, the guy who always tried to get the professors, who, remember, are priests, right, in the seminary, so even in seminary they mess around, I guess, professors off track, and later he became the Archbishop of Bologna. But he and a young man named Dupante, who unfortunately died right before his ordination, the three of them were really a trio. He shares how one evening the three of them, after eating their meal and having a time of what they called recreation, they were sitting around chatting, and then one of them, Manfredi, said this. He said, listen, if Christ is everything, what does that have to do with mathematics? And from that point, those three guys, and remember they're 14, 15-year-old young men, began to seriously approach their lives, really discussing what Christ had to do with everything. It had to do with their free time, their studies, their families. They always had the hypothesis of Christ in their mind. And this quest led to reading certain works. For example, reading Muller, for example, or Sovlev, or reading Newman, John Henry Newman, whose feast we celebrate today. And these were not common readings in his time. In his time, they were, which was a very anti-clerical time in Italy. These were kind of not banned, but they were avoided readings, in which others would join. They invited other kids to join, students to join and read with them. And so they began to call themselves Studium Christi. So they called themselves Studium Christi, and they would go around and really just kind of do this. And then they started to write about their exploration. And so they made a mimeograph of this little magazine they called Christus, and in which they would share what they learned, like what Christ had to do with everything. And there were 3 kids on the seminary campus who didn't like what they were doing, and so those 3 came up with a little magazine called Diabolos, in which they tried to counter everything that these 3 said. And Father Giussani wrote later that he had a little bit of satisfaction when the 3 of them didn't become priests. Anyway, so this intense friendship really lasted him his whole life, literally until the 3 of them, or until the last 2 died. So these are a few pictures of when he became a priest. So this intense friendship, like I said, was really important for him. So 2 months after the close of World War II, in 1945, he was ordained a priest and became the rector of the seminary, asked him to teach in the seminary. So he taught American Protestant theology as well as patristics. He was also assigned to a parish in Milan on the weekends. He turned out to be a very excellent scholar and a systematic thinker, and he thrived in this academic setting. And on the weekends, he would take these long and frequent trips to Milan. In the winter, when he returned back to his seminary room, the room was usually frozen because of the cold. So his rigorous teaching load, intense travels, and poor conditions of the environment exacerbated a very difficult pulmonary situation he had when he was young, and it caused him to be very sick. He lost a lung, and he went into convalescence for a couple of years. And those years were full of prayer, they were full of solitude, but they changed his life in many ways. So in 1951, he returned to his parish work and to his seminary work and published his first tract, so to speak, his first studies. One was on orthodoxy and the second was on Protestantism. And he was on track for a very successful academic career, and that's when it all changed. So he at a certain point was on a train. He was going from Milano to Rimini, which was a seaside, and it was about a 5-hour train ride. And so he went into the train, he got in the train, and he was set in a car with 5 other people, and they were all teenage kids. And so they just struck up a conversation, and Giussani, being a gregarious guy that he was drilling them about school and about work and, you know, what they did in free time and about their faith life, etc. And remember, this is Italy in the 1950s, and so everybody went to Catholic school. Or if you didn't go to Catholic school, you were exposed to religion in your public school. They always had religion class, and they still do in many. Everyone went to Mass. Everyone was baptized Catholic. So it wasn't like there was a lot of diversity then. So anyway, he's on this train with these kids, and then he remembers that it was a conversation that left him with this quote, which he quoted many times. Those kids were frightfully ignorant of the church. Being constrained to blame their mockery and repugnance for the church on their ignorance, from then on, I thought to dedicate myself to rebuild the church presence where it could be rebuilt for students. And so at that point, he went to his rector and he asked if he could go into education, into schools, and he was given free time to do that. And so he left Venegono, where he was a really promising scholar, and went to work in a public high school. And this public high school, Berchet High School, still exists today. It's a very different path that he began to teach there. It's a classical public school. It's considered the most prestigious school in all of Milan. And it was October 1954. So Giussani recalled his beginning at Berchet. I wanted to show the students what moved me. I did not want to convince them that I was right. I wanted to show them that the reasonableness of faith, that is, that a free adhesion to the Christian proclamation was necessary for them to discover the correspondence between what I was saying and the needs of their hearts. So, and he said, ultimately, I do this for their freedom. So he recounts the first day of school. He went up to, he's walking up to his cathedra, which is a seat where the professors would sit when they taught, kind of like a desk that's above everybody. And just when he just took the first step up, there was a hand shot up from the back. And he said, already? He's thinking to himself, already? And the hand shot up, and he looked at the roll sheet and found it was a guy named Pavese. And so he said yes, and Pavese said, you may as well not bother speaking about faith, as we all know that faith and reason have nothing to do with one another. And Giussani was a bit stunned, and he said, can you tell me what faith is? He asked his Pavese. Crickets. And the kids are all snickering. He said, the rest of you, tell me what faith is. Nothing, right? So he gives it a minute. Nothing comes up. Okay, tell me, Mr. Pavese, about reason. What's reason? And same to the crowd. And then at a certain point he said, you talk about faith and reason without even knowing the meaning of the words. It's embarrassing. You're better than that. You're young and you're supposed to enter life with clarity and sincerity. When you don't know something, you need to say, I don't know, and not make great pronouncements. So quoting Niebuhr, Reinhold Niebuhr, he continually challenged presumptions in his students because he believed that men rarely learn what they think they already know. That was Niebuhr. So what drove this certainty was a fact, he said. I was convinced that everyone thinks he already knows about the religious fact, and in general, Christianity in particular. So he was there to teach what Christianity in fact was. So Luigi Negri, who was one of his students in his first class, remembers his freshman year at Berchet, and that's Negri on your right. One of the students said this, the first morning of class, first day at Berchet, I had Italian, history, philosophy, Greek, Latin, and math. The Italian teacher was a socialist ex-priest. The philosophy teacher was an Orthodox Marxist. The classics teacher was a utopian non-believer. And the math teacher was a traditional Catholic for whom following the rules was the optimal. It didn't take me long to understand that Berchet was a battleground of ideologies. The students had 25 hours of class, and only one of them each week was religion. Giussani was the religion teacher. Another student quotes, his courses were dynamic and beautiful, and I was in a pro-Giussani camp because eventually a pro and con Giussani camp began to develop in his classes because of who he was. He said, I was in the pro-Giussani camp, and that 1 hour of class with Father Giussani, as we used to call him, Don Gius, was worth more for our human formation than all of the others put together. So this 1 hour of week that the students had meticulously was prepared by Father Giussani. One former student noted, the lessons were consisting of tight discourse determined by Giussani's statements and provocations to us. Then during the last 15 minutes, He would dictate the notes from which we would write down the lesson. And everyone in my class would take notes. Nobody was forced to. It was just that you perceived that that what he taught was with what he taught, what was at stake was your life. Other classes you could skip out on, especially the theology classes, they said, but not Father Giussani's. No one ever missed. So within a short time, a group of students began to meet outside class with Father Giussani. Those gatherings, which later became weekly meetings, Giussani would bring up topics that dealt with issues of school. So current events, news, things like that, their classes, their homework, people they hung out with, etc. Things that would interest students, and this group grew. In these meetings, which later became called Raji, students were invited to, Raji means raise, students were invited to discuss each topic as it was compared to their personal experience. And in that way, Giussani encouraged them to make a personal comparison rather than a theological or theoretical analysis of the theme that was given. So having made the comparison, Giussani's method was then to help the students judge what they had encountered from the point of view of the Christian hypothesis. So from these Raji, these groups of meetings with kids that he would have once a week after school, and usually in a place off campus, from these Raji, many other activities were born. For example, hiking in the mountains or a retreat in the Mediterranean coast, charitable work, a tritium retreat, and even vacations started to be developed together. The students became protagonists. They even wrote their own newspaper called Milano Studente, in which they judged the culture around them. They became involved in the students became involved in all kinds of civil battles, especially in those days. There was a huge battle for educational freedom going on in Europe, and the students were right in the middle of it, holding conferences, inviting political people to come and speak to students about their positions. So where does faith come in here? How did he teach faith in the Raji? First of all, no activity went unjudged for Father Giussani. So whatever the situation was, everything was judged. He believed that everything had an educative purpose. It was also possible to verify that faith was really for your life. It wasn't something like on the side. So every event was a chance for kids to really verify a Christian proposition in front of them, a position that was not seen as a proposal opposite to reason, but in fact you could dive into reason, you could be reasonable about the experience. These early meetings were the birthplace of the movement, which is known today as communion and liberation, and the initial point of dispersion of Giussani's intuition about faith, which today the church calls a charism. So it's interesting to point out here that Giussani's interest in education was not born from a pedagogical or an academic critique. He wasn't like critiquing the situation that was out there as far as like, there's too much technology or there's garbage books or whatever the case might be. So that was not his purpose. What motivated him was a missionary passion, was really a passion that people might encounter Christ. So what was burning in his heart was that this Christian experience be proposed to young people in a more complete way so that using reason, students could discern what was being proposed. So using reason, they could discern what was being proposed, because he knew also that this meant that the young had to totally engage their freedom, right? So, which was risky. They had to engage their freedom in order to do this work. Giussani did make several pedagogical and academic contributions, but that was not the origin of the reason why he did what he did. Textbooks were born from his pedagogy, schools of thought were born from his pedagogy, and of course educational programs, etc. So what was his critique of education? Okay, first of all, as noted, the problem was method. He said the problem of education is really a problem of method. He saw that an adequate method of education was given by God himself, and that should be the method that we should use in passing on not just the faith, but anything. First, he said that Christianity was the announcement of God made flesh. So what was the method of God? God became flesh, right? So the way in which God entered the world to save the world was not a philosophical idea, right? Nor was it a religious sentiment. It was a fact. So because it was a fact, it was an event in history, right? So Jesus was born of Mary. He lived, he breathed, he suffered, he died. It's a story that you've probably heard, right? It happened, whether people recognize it or not, it happened. It was not up to us. It was not up for us to decide. It happened. So you could meet him, as the Samaritan woman did in John's Gospel. You could listen to him speak, like you hear him proclaim the kingdom of God in Mark's Gospel. You could touch him, as the man born blind in John's Gospel. You could argue with him, as the Pharisees did. So he was a real fact in history. And because Christianity is an event, a fact, right, it implies a method, a proper method. And the method was given by this fact. So someone distinctly objective entered our subjectivity. So he's not far away to be appeased. He's not a thought. He's definitely not a book to pass on. He was encounterable, like going out to coffee with a friend, right? So this is the opposite of what Nietzsche said. There are no facts, only interpretations. Then Jesus chose 12 apostles, right? The next step. He chose 12 people to hang out with. He would encounter other people. They would encounter other people. They would begin to do what Jesus did. They would speak like him. They would baptize like him. They would heal like him. So in their examples throughout the gospel, they would had the power that he had. So we have tons of stories emulating Jesus in towns like Damascus, Bethesda, in Lystra, etc. Then others began to meet Jesus not through the 12, but through those who heard about Jesus from the disciples. So Priscilla and Aquila, for example, in the book of Acts, or St. Augustine in Africa, or St. Aquinas in Spain, or John Henry Newman in England, or Edith Stein in Poland, Tagashi Nagai in Japan. So all these people who met someone who met Jesus began to spread the faith. So Giussani was convinced that this was the only way to teach. And now we're getting into what his method is. Anything from math to basketball, right? Everything can be taught only through a person, through a personal sharing, through an encounter, person to person. Nothing short of that. Nothing short of something fleshy or a personal witness or a presence. So here is where he identified the big problem in education. He said, in the past 100 years, education, and in particular passing on the Christian faith, has been reduced to proposing doctrine, teachings, rules, and values to follow, and then an exam to take. Right? So this is how we think we're passing on the faith. And so here's where he just identified the biggest problem. So he had a stark awakening. I had the stark awakening when I was teaching high school. I was teaching a theology class. This was many, many years ago, and it was the beginning of my career. And I had a student whose name was Bracken, who was absolutely brilliant. He could memorize everything. He knew all the difficult, definitions, transubstantiation and constant. I mean, he knew it all, right? And I just remember at the end of the year having this conversation with him, like, Bracken, brilliant. You did such a great job this year. You seem to, really get everything really well. And I said, do you believe? And he said, absolutely not. And it just was cold water in the face. Where did I go wrong? And I understood Giussani's insistence on method at that point. I had begun to understand this. So the gospel's absolutely riddled with these examples of people who meet the Lord through the Lord, right? So outside of the gospel, there's nothing more fascinating than a following, watching, listening to someone who knows what you don't know and has a passion to share it with you. I have a good friend whose name is Giorgio Ambrosio. He works at the Fermi Lab in Chicago, which is this particle accelerator. He's a particle physicist. So he came to my school and spoke to my students, and a lot of their parents came. It was an evening event. And he's like, begins to like take you into matter. And he uses this beautiful example of Jules Verne's and entering into the center of the universe and whatnot. Then he starts to show us pictures of particle accelerators and how atoms crashing into atoms create energy. And I mean, it was super fascinating, and it was very clear that he loved what he was doing. And at a certain point, a student raised their hand at the very end, and there's a Q&A period. So, Dr. Ambrosia, like, why do you do that? That's like so weird. You're like spending all day looking at things that nobody can see. And he said one word response. He said, beauty. And it was like, you know, I went out and bought a physics book, which I never read. But I mean, just to say that this is exactly what education is. You're bringing people to see what you see. It's like education actually means to lead out, to show you what you cannot see, right? Today, Becca was telling me in the car about a professor she had when she was in college who did that. It was a professor of, don't tell me, anatomy professor who was really tough and worked him to the bone, but he was so passionate and so fascinating. He brings skeletons into the classroom of every beast you can imagine, et cetera, and explain what vertebrae are, et cetera. So you learn from someone like that. They lead you into another world, which allows you to see and to think bigger than, you know, what you would get in a book, so to speak. Right. They lead you from the familiar to the unfamiliar, right? From those things that you see to the things you cannot see. So this is exactly the question of Father Giussani. From the very moment he walked into Berchet High School, and then later when he taught at Sacred Heart University, and in every talk and every lesson he ever gave, speaking to students, speaking to adults, he denounced proposing anything, but especially the faith, through any method other than a human encounter, which was then very unorthodox, and as it is today. You can think about your experience, those of you who are taking classes on Zoom, how tough it is to really learn from a screen rather than a person. So as you know from your experience, you struggle, and you can see us struggle, educators struggle with the content method problem. The content, whether it be Christ again, or physics, or basketball, or whatever, has been proposed just as a set of facts to memorize, rather than something to encounter, something to help you grow. So in the religious realm, conflating the passing on of faith to teaching doctrine has landed us in a really troubling spot today. We see a whole generation and possibly 2 generations that don't practice the faith at all, and they don't even know why they're not practicing the faith. So how did Father Giussani do this? Like, what did he do? What was his method? First, Giussani's method was that students use reason, which was to compare everything, every proposal, whether coming from him or his other teachers or other adults in their life, and to compare them, what they hear, with the profoundness of their humanity, or with their what's called heart. The church calls the heart. And the heart is biblically, it's referred to as the seat of life. It's the place where our inner strength is, this bundle of needs which we have and are born with. It's our metaphysical makeup, the stuff you can't see but you know is there, right? So our need for beauty, our need for love, our need for justice, our need for peace, our need for beauty, that's all part of our heart, right? It's like our barometer in us. And we all need to love, whether we think we need it or not, or whether you want to be in love or have love, it doesn't matter, you have a need for it. And you usually know that you have it when it's sparked, right? Or when it's lacking. You know that you have this need, for example. We'll fulfill it differently. So, for example, for some of you, you'll get married, right? So you'll get married, and that's the way you'll fulfill this need for love, and then you'll just have kids and kids and kids because you need more love and more love, right? Well, for a father, that's a different story. He lives another life. The way he fulfills his needs for love It's through his vocation, his community, his companionship, etc. So these needs are like the engine that drives us. And Giussani understood that. So if you just think of, for example, how powerful the need of beauty is in you, you spend an enormous, if you're like me, an enormous amount of money on clothes, hair, concerts, house, which is, I just bought a house, travel, all those things to fulfill this need for beauty. And it's insatiable. It's absolutely 100% insatiable. So what we buy or consume is just a hint of what we really desire. This infinite desire really needs something infinite to fulfill it. And Apple has figured this out, but we haven't figured it out, right? So we think there's just one more thing I need, just one more vacation, or just one more, dress, or whatever the case might be. So this heart that has this infinite need cannot be eradicated, but it cannot also be duped. You can't convince yourself you're in love with something or something's beautiful when it's not, right? So we fulfill it differently, but we all have this need. So what does it mean to reason? It means to judge everything we hear, everything you see with our hearts, right? With this need within me for fulfillment, for total fulfillment, without censoring anything. So to do this, Giussani would bring reality into his classroom, right? He'd help students understand how to apply judgment, challenging their he could not stand when kids were presumptuous or pretentious, right? Or when they were lazy, or reliance on their sentiment for their decisions. So you learned really quickly you couldn't give a sentimental answer in Father Giussani's class, from what I hear. He would bring art and literature into the classroom. He would bring music into the classroom. I remember seeing a picture of him one time. He was carrying this massive gramophone, right, which is an old record player, right, with a big old horn on it. And apparently there was such an anti-clerical attitude in the school, Berchet, that none of the professors would loan their gramophone to him, so he had to get one from a neighbor and carry it all the way down the road, etc. But he would have them listen to Chopin, or he'd have them listen to Schubert or Schumann, or beautiful pieces of music to explain to them what beauty was, and watch the kids who maybe cried, or the kids who were moved, because they understood. So one of his first students remembers, we learned from this method of reason that we needed to be open to everything, to compare what we saw and heard with the needs revealed from within, from our heart, to avoid every rationalistic reduction, and to test our thoughts within a companionship, first in the classroom, and then with our friends, and then always looking for the truth. He goes on, I was so grateful to Giussani. As in later in my life, I discovered that all of Western philosophical tradition was condensed into his lessons, into his teachings, and he really opened up the world to me. So think how vital this method would be today, learning how to use reason, learning how to think clearly and deeply about things, compare things to our hearts. Just think about the elections that are coming up, and all the debates, and all the, the proposals and counter proposals that you're hearing, really to use your heart and your mind and your friends to help you judge, right? In Giussani's most famous work, which is called The Risk of Education, this book here, okay, he describes a passage in which it's four things which are really essential to understanding his method. The first is that education is a passing on of a tradition. So if you think about your classes here at OSU, every one of your professors is passing on a tradition. They're passing on the tradition of art, or of music, or of physics, or math, or of physiology, or whatever classes you're taking, right? So they're passing on not just the details of those particular courses, but they're passing on a way of looking at those courses. So the word tradition means tradire, means to pass on. So they're not just passing on the datum to you, they're passing on their way of looking at that datum, the way of looking at. And their way of looking at becomes your hypothesis. That becomes your way of looking at. And not because they, just be on a test, right? But it becomes your, the ground with which you begin to look at reality. So the passing on of a tradition is very important. And you all have been passed on tradition your whole life. I, for example, grew up in a home of World War II. My dad was a World War II vet, and both my mother and my father lived through the Great Depression. So they had a way of looking at money that was very different than my generation's way of looking at money. They were very frugal. We didn't waste money. You didn't buy things if you didn't have money. There was no such thing as a credit card in our house. So that kind of set a tradition within me, a hypothesis. So I walked into life with that hypothesis. I could change it later, add to it, build on it, but that was what I was passed on. So all of us are being passed on a tradition, either rich tradition, full of, thinking and art and music and literature, or a very poor tradition. Maybe no one passes anything on to you. Even not passing much on to you is passing something on to you, right? So when Giussani was in the seminary, he remembers, especially in the theologate, that his professors taught them very diverse subjects, but always with Christ as the center. And so from the very beginning, he had like a hypothesis. This tradition was passed on to him, which didn't create like any dissonance. He didn't have different professors saying different things, right? So he had a very strong foundation. His hypothesis moving into his subjects was very strong, that Christ could be verified in everything. Imagine though, for children, imagine a 5-year-old, 10-year-old, walking into life with their tradition at home, and then hearing, or at Berchet High School, hearing all these professors with different traditions, their different way of looking at life, their different way of proposing reality, and how confusing that is if you don't have some kind of, foundation. So, as a child grows into adolescence, so when you're a kid, it's easy to pass on a tradition because generally small kids are very, malleable. They take everything you say. You remember when you were little saying, oh, my dad says, or my mom says, or my teacher told us, all those things, because they've told you what to think and you swallowed it, right? It's just, you're not going to argue, right? So, but what happens when you get to adolescence? A little more complicated, right? So, as a child grows into adolescence, the process of passing on a tradition is kind of complex because the adolescent now must move from absorbing a tradition, right, to now you're acquiring this tradition. So you've absorbed it, now it needs to become yours. So, and this is at the same time when you're going through, your brain's changing a ton, you're developing a critical capacity, and so it's like, Armageddon going on here. So at this point is where Giussani dedicated his life, because he understood for the young, if they didn't have someone help them make sense out of the volatility, so to speak, of that stage of life, that we would fail, the church would fail for sure, in its ability to pass on the faith. So as I said, it's very easy when a child is young to pass on tradition, but when they get older, it becomes much more challenging. So when he taught in Berchet in the 1950s and 60s, but especially in the 1960s, the school culture in Milan was full of unrest. There were strikes, there were walkouts, professors canceling classes, metro strikes going on, protests. It was a super chaotic time. So students entered the school with a tradition they received at home and in an elementary school. And at Berchet, the professors were wanting them to forget their tradition. Get rid of your tradition, start over, build a new world. It's kind of utopian society. Start at zero, blank slate, which is impossible. Right? We cannot eradicate what we've been given. So the few teachers in the school who were Catholic, who were faithful people, they just wanted to retreat to the bunker, to the Catholic bunker, and they wanted to follow teachings and rules exactly as they were, etc. So eradicating this tradition, as I said, is impossible. So you can't tear it out. And Giussani had said wanted students to be able to learn to look at what they've been given, to their worldview, to the point of view that they're hearing, this tradition, and do as St. Paul said, look at it all and sieve out that which is good. Like, examine it all and pull out that which is useful. So he was convinced that the real freedom was not going to happen by throwing out tradition, but instead by being able to judge our tradition. So, which in this case was completely challenging because you had to be involved with the students to do that. Giussani brings up that another note bene here, another important point. He says that some parents would avoid passing on any kind of tradition to their students. They kind of shirk, or their children, they shirk that duty, right? And so you've heard this before. You're not baptized, some of you, for example, because your parents wanted you to decide. Or giving a cell phone to a child who doesn't have the capacity to really know how to use well. Push the buttons, yes, but how to navigate all the things that come at them through a cell phone. Or in the case of gender, letting kids choose when they're very young, 5, 6, 7, if they're a girl or a boy, etc. So the autonomy of a child that's given early, Giussani spoke about this quite often, that was a problem. Because, why? Because the early autonomy to premature freedom would not respect the structure of our human growth, right? So a child doesn't have a critical capacity, doesn't have an ability, doesn't yet have a hypothesis, with which to enter that. And on the contrary, if a young person does not have a strong sense of self, of belonging, of tradition, etc., this autonomy can easily spiral into self-alienation, subjecting the young person to social and cultural pressures without having developed the tools to make a judgment that's reasoned, right? So too much freedom too early in life, he was quite critical of. And it really is a challenge of parenting today that we often see, especially in education, parents allowing their students to do things that, yet that an adult would do. So think, for example, of the number of messages we get today. When Father Giussani was young, I remember he was floored when he heard that, his students would watch one movie a week. He was floored. It was like, what? If he knew there were 3 or 4 a day that often students watch today. So he said if there's no guide with a strong hypothesis of meaning, he said if a young person doesn't have a guide with a very strong hypothesis of meaning, then the voices of consumerism, the voices of self-affirmation will really help a young person feel lost or anxious or unable to make a commitment. Okay, so the first point of education is passing on a tradition. The second is a pedagogical point, is that the authority in the student's life, young person's life, is important. So this word generally, authority, has a bad rap, right? Authority, we think, a boss who's lording his power over us or whatever. But the word authority actually means auctoritas, which means to make one grow. Authority literally means to make one grow. And by nature, those responsible for a child's education should be authorities, parents and teachers. So an authority is one who proposes a tradition, for example, teaching and demonstrating the meaning of something, and thus propose to the young people a way in which to look at it. So an authority is really a place of hypothesis, a hypothesis on tennis shoes, somebody who offers you something, right? For a young person to bump into an authority is to meet someone really who has a rich tradition, as your example Becca gave me today, right? Somebody who has a clear understanding of who they are, where they're going, and why what they're teaching is important. They know who they are, and and they know how to fascinate and to spark wonder in you. So they live what you desire ultimately. So when you have an authority in your life, and I'd like you to think about this, they kind of live what you want to be. You want to be like them. They're people who have something that you would desire for your life, right? It's important to note here that Giussani's concept of authority has nothing to do with authoritativeness, right? This authoritarianism that the my boss, right? But which suppresses freedom often, but instead an authority will bring your freedom out. It's important also in the risk of education to note that only an authority can educate. So if your teachers, your parents are not people of rich tradition, most likely they're challenged with education, which I'm not asking you to point out your parents, oh my gosh, look at my parents, they didn't pass anything on to me. They did. I can think of a principal I used to work for years ago, Rudy, who was a man of authority, right? And he didn't lord his authority over us, but he had an ability to listen. He was a super wise man, a great writer. He was a very well written and read man. And he had the ability also to not just listen to you, but also help you take a next step. And every teacher loved him in this school. He was a great cook too, and he loved classical music, and he loved rock and roll, he loved everything. And just he was the kind of guy who looked you in the eye and cared about you and where you wanted to go. In fact, I think all of us felt, we talked to him after he died, wait, no, I was his favorite. No, I was his favorite. No, I was his favorite, right? So he was really an authority for us, somebody we looked to help us take the next step in our life, right? So, so I think that the authority is somebody that's essential in our life, Giussani would say. I don't think that's Giussani said it. And it's true, right? We always need authorities our whole life. It's not like I need an authority when I'm in high school or when I'm in college. I need an authority my whole life, right? Because if you're going to be a father, you have to have, or if you're going to be a father to someone, you have to be a son to someone. If you're going to be, teaching someone, you have to be able to learn from somebody else, right? So, So in authority, he says, is absolutely essential. The next point, the vital concept in his pedagogy, and this is point 3, is that criticism and verification are really a part of his pedagogy. So what is criticism and what is verification? First of all, criticism, also bad rap. Criticism is a good word. It means to grapple with, to struggle with, to dig through something. That's what it means to be critical, coming from Kuhnian. So he talks about how often in the educational realm, we're afraid of criticism. We're afraid of that, pushing to go beyond, etc. So the word problem, to make a problem out of things, we don't want to make a problem out of things. So I have my agenda, I have what's on my whiteboard or what's on my PowerPoint, and you're going to learn it, you're going to regurgitate it back on a test, etc., and now you're educated. And instead, an educator makes a problem out of things. And problem is, again, good word. You put it in front of your eyes, you look at it, you say, is this true, is this not true, right? It's the pushing of you to make the choice. So ultimately, what education means is that you have to use your freedom. So a teacher in no way can usurp the freedom of the kid, the authority of the kid to make a decision. And this is a challenge, again, too, of parenting. It's a challenge of your professors, and it's a challenge among friendships, right? We want not our, it's kind of the overprotective helicopter parent or the professor who doesn't want to have challenges in classes. So I don't want you to be free. I don't want you to be critical, because if you're free and you're critical, which is necessary for you to really be convinced that something is true, you can never have conviction unless you freely choose it, right? And choose it doesn't mean I get an A on a test, as Bracken shared with me very clearly. So, and the risk of education, he writes, we have been too afraid of criticism and reduced it to negativity, to ask questions about what we are told. Asking yourself, is it true, has become tantamount to doubt. So we even use that word wrong, the word doubt, right? So what happens if a young person is not allowed to be critical in front of what they're taught, right? Not allowed to ask questions, not allowed to say, I don't know if I agree with that, etc. One of 3 things happens. One, he says, either you become cynical. Well, there is no answer, right? There is no answer. It's all abstract and there is no answer. Or you become indifferent. I really don't care. This has nothing to do with me, so I really don't care. Or a traditionalist, right? And traditionalist has nothing to do with Latin Mass. It has to do with, traditionalist means that you're entrenched in following rules. I'm just going to follow the rules, do what I have to do. I'm not going to make any waves. I'm going to get my A's and go on. I'm going to make my boss happy and go on, right? So then what happens? We end up living this life that's dualistic, fragmented. I'm this person here, that person there, etc. So again, from the risk of education, from my very first hour of class, Father Giussani said, I've always said, I'm not here to make you adopt the ideas I have to give you as your own, but to teach you a true method for judging the things that I say. And the things that I say and the things that are the things that I've experienced. And that experience has a very long past. In fact, the experience is based on a method which has a past of 2,000 years. So the educator needs to tirelessly reawaken the freedom of the young person by constantly proposing that work of the young person in front of them. So, last point. So the fourth and final element of his pedagogy basically is the question of risk and freedom. And I think I've addressed that already a little bit. The process of criticism and verification is absolutely essential for you to reach conviction, right? So a life in the classroom that allows a way of testing everything is really a risk. If you are a teacher, or if you have had a teacher who allows you to ask a lot of questions and engage and disagree, and that's risky. It's risky for the teacher, right? Because it doesn't follow my agenda, it doesn't cover, that's not on my list of things to get done today, right? So that's a risk for the teacher, right? It's a risk also, the constant questioning of you, and you might not know the answer, which parents often find themselves being asked questions they can't answer, as do professors, right, or teachers. So that's a risk, but it's not just a risk for the teacher, it's also a risk for the young person. So to create an environment in a classroom, whatever the classroom might be, or in your home, or among your friendships, where you really challenge each other, that's risky, right? Because you're pushing yourself to go beyond where your frail freedom wants to go, right? You're pushing the other to go beyond where they want to go. So, but this risk and this freedom go hand in hand. Like, risky doesn't mean often what we think it does. Risky means that I risk going beyond where I'm comfortable, and I allow my friends or my professors or my parents to like, in a sense, invade my space, so to speak, right? But not to invade my space to usurp my authority, but quite the opposite, so that I have to know who I am, why I do what I do. So this is and one more quote I wanted to share. Our educational approach emphasizes enormously the freedom of the person. The freedom of the person is a non-negotiable, right? Education is, after all, to lead out, but you're not leading them out to nowhere, to being free people, able to generously be in relationship with God and the entirety of reality. So, so that's more or less his points, and that's Father Giussani. One of the things he did, I didn't share with you this, but in order to help the kids have an experience of this risking, of going beyond where you naturally would stop, is he taught them to do charitable work, which is just a key element of the Catholic faith. And he would take them in buses on Sunday, which is their only day of school off because they go to school on Saturday, in buses to the ghetto of Milan called La Bassa. And these are pictures of his students playing. They play with them, do catechism, sing, have mass together, etc. So basically blowing your Sunday, right? Giving your Sunday to charitable work. And then he'd judge with them, like, what was your experience? What did you have? What did you hear? Was it worth your time? Was it not worth your time, right? He couldn't stand when his students said, I'm not going to, because preemptively of having an experience. But if you afterwards said, hey, this was a waste of time. Like, I heard this, I saw that, I really think it's a waste of time. Okay, he probably pushed you a little bit, but at a certain point, you've got to make a choice, right? But he pushed you to make that point. So, just a few pictures I'll share with you of the students who rallied around him. This is when he went off to the university. As I said, there was a big movement for about 2 years of the fight for freedom and education. And this was across Europe, and not just in Italy, but the students would organize all kinds of things. So, yeah, he believed also, another thing about him, and then I'll close and let you ask questions, was that all of this didn't happen just between the teacher and the student. All of this back and forth, all this carrying on didn't happen, but it happened within a communion. And you need that communion your whole life. You know, you don't just need a communion for when you're in school, like to help me navigate the questions of life. It's your whole life. once you have children, to help you navigate bedtime and, you know, too much TV or not enough TV and all those questions, and a communion of friends who make decisions together for the same reason as a communion in a classroom, learning together, takes you just that much further. You're able to verify this is the best thing to do, in a sense. So, Father Giussani died in 2005. He died shortly before John Paul II, very shortly before John Paul II, a couple months. And Father John Paul II would have done the funeral, except he was too sick. And so, so Cardinal Ratzinger did the funeral. So the funeral had 50,000 people at it. It was the largest funeral since when San Carlo Borromeo, St. Charles Borromeo had died. She was the Bishop of Milan. So yeah. So I was going to show a video, but we kind of ran out of time, so, and that's my bad. So what I would like to do is ask a few minutes for questions, I guess. Did you want to introduce that, or can I introduce it right away, or whatever? Yeah, I hope you have some questions based on your experience in your classes with past education or whatever, or anything that I said that made absolutely no sense whatsoever.
All right, wonderful. So if you guys have any burning questions that you absolutely need to ask her, or like you're gonna go to heaven unsatisfied, like ask and I'll pass it by.
Good job.
We'll start off with one that might be hard. Let's see if we can do it.
Okay.
Okay, so obviously we talked about good ways to be teaching, have authority, have a rich tradition, but we're learning.
Yeah.
What are some good tips for seeking out teachers with a good tradition, more personal contact ways of learning things?
Yeah, excellent, excellent. Okay, so we always have an authority around us. There's no one that doesn't have somebody who is in front of us, who is one who's able to help us act, help us look, etc. It's looking for them. When you run into an authority, you just know it. You know, when you run into someone who's fascinating to you, you want to be like, no one has to convince, hey, do I want to be like that guy? No, no one has to convince you. You already know, right? So looking for people in your life, you know, and praying, asking the Lord, you know, give me somebody in my life who can help me go to the next step. So it's always about, who do you follow? Like, am I following? And it's your whole life, it's this way. I'm 62 and I'm still following my friends. I don't make decisions on my own. I ask, hey, what do you think? What do you think? I have to make the decision. No one tells me what to do, right? Except, you know, me, right? But I, you know, for me to be able to have a companionship of friends who I can share my life with is absolutely 100% essential. And so I would say, you know, have a look at your professors. Who are the ones that are sparking in you a joy, an interest? You know, how many times have you been in a class you hate the subject, but the professor's so fascinating? It's like, oh, I really love that subject. I'm studying it like a madwoman or a madman, right? Why? Because that person for you is an authority, right? Now, your authorities will change too in life. That's the last thing I'll say on that. So the authority for me and in my beginning of my career were certain friends, and, you know, at this point in my life, other friends, right? So other people. Father Giussani was an authority for me at a certain point when he was alive, someone I could speak to. But after him, it became other people. So, yeah. But the need never disappears.
Did you get to speak to him personally?
I did.
Nice.
I was very graced, very blessed to be able to. Thank you. Thanks for that question.
Can everybody hear me? Okay. Thank you so much for the talk. I had a question about how to apply the method that you discussed today in a more anthropological or adult and non-traditional student sense, especially at colleges and universities.
Right. It's the same method. It's a method with your children. It's a method with, you know, old people's homes. It's really a matter when you think about, first of all, you know, living in communion with one another, sharing life together, but challenging each other. So your friend says to you something here in class, for example, that you're not agreeing with, or you're not sure. You want to say it. You want to share it, right? Rather than go like, well, I'm not going to say anything. right? So it doesn't matter how old we are, really. I mean, his method is for our life, and it's not just for judging the faith, right? So if there are questions about faith, right, we have all kinds of people to ask, right? To not ask those questions is to not take advantage of the nature that we have. Our nature is a communal nature. It's not a, you know, we have lived in such an individualistic society. I know that from my own experience too. I mean, I do too. I drink the same water everybody else does, breathe the same air. We really do see that, yeah, there's temptation is to decide on my own, but really to begin to share, to ask professors, to challenge them, not challenge them in a negative way, but to say, I don't understand that. Can you please help me understand? That's not my understanding of this thing you said. Can you help me understand better? That dialogue back and forth. So, yeah, I mean, Jasani would do this with high school kids initially, and then eventually moved into the university, and he never changed anything. Yeah. You're welcome. That's a good question. Thank you.
Hi. So I listened and picked up lots of discomfort with the concept of moral relativism. So I have a question.
Yeah.
As far as I'm aware, the Pope has recently approved blessings for same-sex couples. Now that's different from a marriage, but this is a new teaching that wasn't there previously. So if the Pope is speaking inerrant gospel, then why has this changed? Is that somehow non-relativistic? If that's changed over the last half decade?
Yeah. All right. First of all, I'm not a theologian, and you do have one here. So it's a question you can ask Father at another time. And, you know, I'm not shirking the question. I don't feel like I have the authority or the wisdom or the knowledge to answer that question. But it is a good one. And I think, see, there you go. You have a question. You have every right to ask that question, but I'm not the right person, unfortunately. But I pointed you to a person who could. That's a good question. See, this is an example of the kind of environment you want to have in a classroom or in a home or whatever, where you can ask things that get stuck in your craw. You need to get out. You need to, you know, but the problem is to find an authority. Who's the authority? Somebody can help me with this, right? So Father can help you with that, for sure.
All right.
There's one more?
I'm sorry, we're running a little bit behind over on time, so I'm sorry, bud. So that's going to be all for questions. Thank you so much.
Okay, I apologize. I'm happy to answer a question afterwards.
Yeah, so thank you so much for everybody who asked questions, and thank you so much, Dr. Peterson, for coming in and speaking with us. Do you have an announcement?
Oh, yeah, sure.
So before I get into the announcements, I want to give a special thank you to all the sponsors that make these intellectual conversations, along with everything we do at the Newman Center possible. And for those who don't know, the Newman Center puts on other events throughout the term, including Alpha, which I can put up here on the screen. Alpha, which is a 7-week course, which is where we discuss the bigger questions of life. We offer a short talk, which is followed by small group discussions, where we invite you to bring your questions on life, faith, and God. In the first 3 weeks of Alpha, we're going to ask, what is happiness? Is faith reasonable? And who is Jesus? Alpha meets on Tuesday nights. That says 7:30, but I promise you it's 6:30. It begins 2 weeks from now on October 22nd. The first night will be hosted at the MU in room 109. We welcome students of all backgrounds, faiths, and worldviews. So on your way out of the auditorium, if you want to stop by the table that's out there, you can get more information or just pick up a flyer for Alpha.
And if you enjoyed tonight's conversation and you would like to learn more about the Newman Center, you can visit osunewman.org for upcoming events and to get more involved. We are so happy that you were all able to join us this evening. Stay tuned for our next lecture, which will take place in the winter term on January 15th. It's going to be a fascinating virtual lecture presented by Dr. Robert J. Spencer on the Shroud of Turin. We hope you enjoyed the lecture, and I hope you have a wonderful night.
Thank you.